Welcome to the second part of this conference organized by The Shift. Before we get started, we have a short presentation by Dami Ujuri. Dami is a legal officer at Thomson Reuters Foundation, where she leads the legal components of a media defense project. She's also an international human rights lawyer. So we have this short presentation before we get to our discussion.
Thank you. Okay, I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me at the back. Yep. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so the session, the brief presentation I'm going to give should be on the, here it is. Right, so as I said, my name is Dami Ujuri, and I work at Thomson Reuters Foundation on a project that focuses on exiled media. So I lead the legal components on that project. So to begin, what is exiled media? So exiled media are journalists or media management who have to leave their countries, be it by way of a war or some sort of destruction of the rule of law that means that they're not able to continue to work in a safe legal environment. So these are the types of media we work with on this project. So TRF's support to exiled media composes of three things. The first is legal advice, legal research, and legal seminars. And we'll be expanding the jurisdictions we work in, but for now, we've been working with exiled media who've been exiled in Germany, but we'll be expanding to other European countries. And that's been quite interesting because we've been able to identify certain legal challenges facing media who've had to leave their countries of origin. One of those legal challenges is understanding the legal landscape or the requirements across two or more jurisdictions. So you're dealing with media who don't just have the challenge of being compliant with their country's laws, but they now have to understand how to work within a new one. And in Europe, you'd think that's probably quite easy. But for instance, the types of media we work with are media who are considered dissident media. So in reality, they've had to learn not to comply with their law, because if they were to have complied with their law, they wouldn't be able to speak truth to power. And I'll work through some of these by way of the research that we've just put together. So we've just published two pieces of legal research for journalists looking at exiled media settled in Germany. The first is a civil defamation piece of research. So within Germany, some of you may know that civil defamation is quite an easy way of kind of getting to media. And actually, the German legal system is quite sympathetic to the protection of defamation. There is a general protection of personality rights. So kind of Article 8 of the European Convention trickles down quite strongly in German domestic law. What that looks like is that there are also various ways of defending yourself if you're public interest media or exiled media. And one of those is the public interest defense. So we worked with German practitioners who helped to put this together. But the reality for exiled media is this. Defamation, when you're working in a very different country, means that the subject of that reporting will not necessarily be in Germany. For instance, if you're a Russian journalist, you're probably going to be writing about Russian politicians or bodies who are against the Russian people or Russian democracy. So how useful is a system, a defamation system for those types of media? I guess what I'm trying to say is that exiled media face a slight gap in the law. We have to start thinking about how we can use the law to bridge the gaps that exiled media face. These are media who have to deal with gaps in the law that makes them consider how to settle within a new country and how to make sure they don't get into trouble in their former countries. The other thing about exiled media is that they tend to want to keep their original target audience. If you're exiled, you want to have, let's say, for Belarusian media, you want Belarusians to read your text. You don't really, it's not really written for a German audience or a European audience. So let's talk about the protection of sources. If your sources are mainly in your country of origin, so let's say Belarus, how then do you make sure they're protected back there through the laws that exist in your current state, so your host state? It's quite difficult. And this piece of research shows that even though German law is supportive of the protection of journalistic sources, it can only do so much. You can have the political support for Russian or Belarusian politicians who want to know their sources. And you can also have a state where, because your sources are in your host country, there's no way of them being protected in reality, because the law doesn't allow for that. We're looking at putting together a few more pieces of legal research, and that's in the way of kind of criminal defamation. I know criminal defamation is probably not something that kind of SLAPP's lawyers or those who work in this space are happy to hear about, but it does still exist in certain European countries, Germany being one of them. So how do we make sure that these sorts of legal weapons are dealt with and address exiled media who have to think about more than one legal landscape? And then copyright law and other such things. So I just wanted to speak a bit about this piece of research so we don't forget about the journalists who are also having to deal with more than one legal landscape, more than one kind of set of laws, and thinking about how we can do something about it by way of filling up the gaps in the law, be it through international law or other such lobbying activities. I don't know if, yes, there it is. So get in touch. I'm happy to speak about the work that I do and the way we support exiled media, especially if you work with exiled media. But anyway, let's have a chat, and I'm very happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Okay, for the second part of this debate, we're going to be looking at the impact of legal tools being used to disrupt the day-to-day work of journalists, and how we can fight back to make sure it doesn't impact the public's right to know. We've got 5 other guests on this panel, starting with Jamie Weissman from the International Press Institute, Flutura Kusari from the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, Matthew Caruana Galizia from the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation, Peter Gagan, former editor of Open Democracy and now with OCCRP, and Father Joe Borch, who's a media expert and a University of Malta lecturer. Jamie, I can start with you. We often hear these acronyms, GDPR, FOI, SLAPP, acronyms which mean absolutely nothing to most people and are confusing even to us journalists sometimes. Are these in reality a concoction by policymakers to stop the media from probing too much? It's all complicated out there, isn't it?
Well, thanks, Herman, for the question, and yeah, good to be here, first of all. I think, yeah, whenever we talk about lawfare, the law and journalism and how they interact, it's always important to think that, on the one hand, laws are designed, and if implemented properly, are there to protect journalism, to investigate attacks on journalists. But on the other hand, there's this Janus-faced approach where if there are flaws or gaps in legislation, they can so easily be abused to attack journalism as well. So GDPR, FOI, these should be, freedom of information and data protection, these should be tools which enable journalism, which foster good journalism, but when abused, that's the issue. SLAPPs as well, strategic litigation against public participation, a trend we see increasing across the EU. Of course, these are tools which we're seeing spreading across the EU, Europe, and globally to silence critical journalism and kind of suffocate the free press. So, in the wrong hands, these tools can be abused very easily. Yes.
Yeah. Flutura, I mean, you lead the Anti-SLAPP work at the European level as part of a coalition against SLAPPs in Europe. What kind of threats against journalists have you documented, and have you seen a common thread whenever you are contacted by media outlets? Whenever you get that phone call from an editor saying, we're in shit, please help us.
Yeah. So if something would happen to a journalist 10 years ago, it would take quite some time to document that at international level. And now things have changed, and if something happens to a small village in Kosovo, to a journalist, and I mentioned Kosovo because of the tensions there, I think we would need maximum 40 minutes to register this and to document this at least in 2 international platforms. And that would, and when we say registering, that would mean making it public internationally that something happened to a journalist. And this is because, first and foremost, association of journalists and unions are better organized. I know this is not the case in all countries, but in a lot of countries. And secondly, you have now international organizations collaborating much more. We have at least 2 international platforms that document threats against journalists. That is the Council of Europe Platform on Safety of Journalists, and Mapping Media Freedom, which is run by ECPMF in collaboration with IPI, EFJ, and other partners. So what happens if a journalist is either threatened legally or physically attacked, etc.? We get in touch, sometimes directly with them, sometimes through our partners, depending on how strong the local organization is. We collect the facts, and then we register them, and we call this description of cases as alerts. And what do we do with this information that we collect is mainly we use it to put pressure, but we're using the word advocate. So this is to advocate before, especially international community, to take measures.
Sorry if I may stop you there. So what you're saying is you are going to put an online alert. This organization in Kosovo has been slapped, and we are following you. So what you are basically telling the authorities is, we're watching you.
So we do that, exactly. So if for example, we had a case, a businessman who has ties with Bulgaria sued Times of Malta and Manuel Delia, and the entire information about this case is public. The name of the businessman, which I don't recall now, it's not that I don't want to mention, and then all the procedure that happened, and we're following that. Now, this is important because when we started to work on anti-SLAPP, every time we went to a politician, they would say, oh, sorry, but there is no data. Please prove that this is a problem so that we can react. And this is absolutely key to document what is happening. If we want to go to politicians in Malta and say, look, you have to implement a recommendation 2016 of the Council of Europe, then very often you get the answer, yeah, but we don't have so many incidents. I'm not saying this about Malta, but generally this is the reaction. So documentation is very important. And most of the SLAPP lawsuits that are now part of the case report, which was produced by Daphne's Foundation, is a collection of the evidence that we've collected throughout Europe. I also want to say that we sometimes kind of suffer with journalists who don't want to come forward. I do understand that they don't want to become the story. In some countries, they don't do this because it adds more stress to their family members. But we need to document them. We need to document what is happening so that we go to prime ministers and presidents and people at a European level and ask them to react. And the information that is collected, especially with Council of Europe platform, is information that is used by the Secretary General of Council of Europe. It's used in the Committee of Ministers, mainly to name and shame countries which are not protecting journalists as they should. So it's super important that we document threats against journalists.
This reluctance to come forward, I'm assuming, comes from journalists operating in rogue states, yes?
Yes, so majority of journalists, especially those who are covering politics and court reportings, but how we've countered this is we've asked other journalists to convince their friends. For example, every time we have cases, not only in Malta, but also across Europe, I would go and ask Matthew, can you call this journalist and please explain why it's important to document? And then you get all the facts in one day. So that helps.
Jamie?
Maybe, yeah, just a few words on the collection of the data. This monitoring platform, Mapping Media Freedom, it's been established for 4 years now. We have a consortium of press freedom organizations from around Europe which are adding cases, physical attacks, murders, surveillance, but also legal threats. So in the last 3 years, we've documented 2,391 total cases, affecting 3,769 journalists, media workers, media outlets. So it's a huge amount of data. Then we can look into the trends. We have a filtering system where if you want to see how many slaps there are in Malta in 2021, you can go in and use that filtering system. If you want to see how many media outlets have been closed or censorship acts in Hungary in the last year, you can also go into that system. And in 2023, of legal incidents, we documented 230. These were slaps, criminal defamation, closure of media outlets, blocked access to FOI. So yeah, the monitoring is that first fundamental part of the work. That then leads out to advocacy and to support, which maybe Flutura can talk about as well.
Yeah, briefly, just one more comment on this. The documentation has also helped to counter the narrative and the propaganda a lot of prime ministers and presidents do about their own countries. As you know, politicians like to pay these PR companies.
I never knew that.
So that they have an excellent reputation internationally. To give you an example, in Albania, for example, if you looked at the data in Albania 5 years ago, you would think that's heaven for journalists. It's the opposite. It's one of the very dangerous countries to do journalism in Europe. And this was not known because there was no data. And now MFRR has a special focus on Albania and also Serbia, so that we make it, we provide to the public the information about what is happening there.
Yeah. Peter, according to you, what are the main threats to journalists these days?
I think there's a lot going on actually. Before that though, I also want to echo what some people said earlier about how privileged it is to be here talking about these issues. Like, I know it can feel if you're in somewhere like Malta that they're only Maltese issues, and I think journalists can often feel like that wherever they are. These issues are only just affecting you in your jurisdiction, and I think Malta is such an apt place to have this conversation, but it's great to have people from all around Europe on this panel talking about it. And in terms of the kind of threats that we're seeing, you know, Keelan Gallagher talked about it a bit in the previous panel, that defamation and SLAPP suits are one aspect of it. Defamation law, whether it's in Malta, I'm based in London, the London law courts have been used for a long time to silence journalists. But they aren't the only issues we're seeing as journalists. You're seeing, like what Flutura is talking about, their threats against journalists as journalists as individuals, as people, the physical threats. But there's also a lot more legal threats. We're seeing the use of data protection laws to silence journalists. Actually, if you follow the current case that's going on in London with Donald Trump and Christopher Steele, it's quite fun. It's quite an interesting case too. It's quite lively. The court transcripts are more lively than a lot of other court transcripts. But it sounds like a defamation case. Donald Trump is taking Christopher Steele to court over the Steele dossier and saying these things are untrue. But he's not actually using defamation law to do it because he'll be timed out. It's a year and a day you have, and he's using its personal data. So we're seeing that. We're seeing much more like kind of paralegal attempts to silence journalists as well. You know, in my daily working for 10 years as a journalist, I've seen almost every type of conceivable lawsuit against you. But the one thing that I think we're also starting to see is journalists talking about it a bit more, but it's still very much a hidden secret, I think. You know, I wrote a piece for Open Democracy about 2 years ago where I wrote about how Jeffrey Donaldson, who's now the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, had sued me. And I was really resistant to writing it. I only wrote it because he then became the leader of the party in 2021. And the case was dead for about a year and a half, but he had sued me personally. And afterwards, I got so many emails and direct messages on Twitter from journalists in the UK saying the same thing had happened to them. Similar stories, but they didn't talk about it. So I think there's still a lot of that, and it's what's so important about getting this data and this information to see what's happening. My one caveat and concern is that we get the law to the place we need it to be to, say, tackle SLAPPs in terms of defamation, but it's whack-a-mole. Something starts coming up in other places. So that's probably my biggest fear at the moment.
The previous panel, there was an interesting point raised that it is not only important for journalists to protect themselves, but to actually find the means to fight back. I don't know we can open it to anybody, maybe Father Joe, yes. No. Can we fight back? Aren't we busy enough in our jobs?
But give me 15 seconds to get something off my chest. Because the research we heard before said that the culprits are business people, politicians, and government people in that order. I don't think it's correct.
What do you mean?
The culprits are lawyers, business people, politicians, and because the business people would not have made the case had there not been a lawyer to do it.
Yeah,
So if we are going to
But
name
it's lawyers'
and
jobs,
shame-
no?
No, it's
Not
not.
to abuse the law.
No, it's not a lawyer's job.
We have a lot of lawyers
to
here,
abuse,
so-
yeah, but it's not a lawyer's job to abuse laws to attack freedom. So what can we do? I think we made a big mistake that we left ourselves to be painted into a corner. SLAPP is a problem for journalists. No, SLAPP is not a problem for journalists. SLAPP is a problem for each and every person in this room and out there who needs to know what's happening in the country so that they can be active citizens. But if we silo the problem, I think we'll not succeed. Why should government care? Even if you go on Maltese journalists today and you ask, you are a working journalist, you ask 10 journalists, what is the biggest problem for journalists in Malta? They will tell you, we have a lot of work, we have few resources. They will not tell you SLAPP. So unless we conscientize journalists and we conscientize people out there that this is their problem, will not move government to do anything.
Do you agree, Matthew, with his point of view? Do we need to start looking at a bit more holistically this problem of SLAPP and the legal threats against journalists?
Yes, of course. I mean, one of the things that the UK coalition against SLAPPs has been able to do, it's a part of CASE, the coalition against SLAPPs in Europe, which I am sort of vicariously proud of, is that they've been able to change the regulations for solicitors in the UK at the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I mean, of course, they haven't done that themselves, but they've done it in discussion with the SRA. And this has created new ethical standards for solicitors in the UK. That makes it easier for those on the receiving end of SLAPPs to file complaints against the lawyers themselves. And I think this is one of the most effective ways in which we can fight back. Where you have groups of lawyers that are hired by government, I mean lawyers that are friendly to government, perhaps are a part of the political campaign. And one of the ways in which the party in government pays off those lawyers for services rendered is by contracting their services for SLAPPs. And we see this in the 40 cases against the shift. Then we would have a tool with which we can fight back against these services which are being provided abusively, in my opinion.
We also like to name and shame lawyers. And just to say that we promise we will continue as CASE to name and shame all those lawyers who abuse the law to go against journalists. Very often we have cases where politicians and business person would go to lawyers and would say, look, this is happening, I don't know what to do, and it's lawyers proposing to go after journalists. Yes, I understand and respect access to court, and everyone should have the right to defend their reputation, but to file unfounded claims requiring up to 1 million euros and sometimes more from a journalist because he ran an article, public interest journalism with verified facts, that's not access to court, that's abuse of law.
Fluturas, is this prevalent across Europe? So are you saying that the client goes to the lawyer and the lawyer exacerbates the case to such an extent to go for a killer penalty here?
So we have, the ECPMF has a legal fund. We've provided €500,000 support in lawyers' fees in the last 9 years. And we supported around 200 journalists. Most of the cases, and I've spoken to them personally, so the information that they have collected, it's lawyers proposing to their clients such measures. Some clients, they already know. Clients, I mean politicians and business persons. They now know, they've learned this trick. But very often it's lawyers saying, look, let's sue them. It wastes their time. It's very expensive. And what is more important, by this, they send a message to others. And we've seen this, I think, happening also here and in other countries.
Let me get Peter first.
Yeah, it's a huge... What I've seen in my experience is you will have some law firms who... It's hard to not believe they're actually not actively seeking cases. I've had the same law firm, a Northern Irish law firm, representing political parties in Northern Ireland, come to me time and time and time again, often before the political parties even responded with a comment the law firm is there on it. And this is a real issue that certain law firms, and they're well-known blue chip law firms in London in particular, they're known as the people you go to, and it's very hard to see that they are not exacerbating some cases because they're making huge sums of money. For certain law firms, this is a huge business. You know, Shillings in London, which does a lot of defamation laws, just announced that they're going to go basically into the full PR. They're already doing a lot of reputation management. They're going to basically open up a PR shop as well. This is where law firms are going with this. And that's, again, where SLAPPs is one part of an arsenal, in which part of it's public relations, part of it's private intel, part of it's SEO washing on search engines to pull down the rankings of people. This is part of a palette of things that are offered to politically exposed people and the rich and powerful to be able to wash their reputations.
Yeah. Jamie?
Yeah, I think it's been mentioned before, but keen to reiterate this. This is why it's so important to have these naming and shaming mechanisms. And it was mentioned in the first panel where the Case Coalition's annual SLAPP awards have had a real impact. Charlie presents them excellently every year. So we have the SLAPP Politician of the Year, SLAPP Lawyer of the Year, and SLAPP Business Person or Oligarch of the Year. We've had Prigozhin winning, for example, the late Prigozhin and others. And we'll continue to do that moving forward year on year on year.
Yeah. I'd like to pick on a point maybe before what, Father Joe said, like maybe we should really start naming and shaming lawyers. But ultimately, there is a big problem here with businessmen. People, very rich businessmen who are ultimately, they have the power, they are using money as a tool to suppress freedom of speech. So are we saying that basically if you have the money, and there are a lot of people in Malta especially who have a lot of money, are they the main instigators against freedom of speech? Yeah.
Exactly, but that's why I said that SLAPP is not a problem for journalists, because in a democracy, we say that power belongs to the people, and the people then give that power for a limited period of time to politicians. In this situation, we are saying concretely that it's business people who have power. They can decide what I can read or what I can write. And this is a right of everybody. I have spoken this week with several journalists who have been slapped. And they say, first, it's rage. You are angry. Then you say, what can we do about it? And then you say, but is it worth it that I work on these stories and get into all this trouble? Instead of working on this story and get a lot of trouble, I'll work on clickbaits. And I'll get a lot of viewers. So the audiences are a big problem. Unless we help audiences realize that they are the real victims.
Okay, how can we do that?
Yeah, but okay, it's very difficult to do it. I'll tell you why. Because all surveys show that the people's trust in journalists is not very high. Eurobarometer, it's always under 50%. I think television is about 30 or 40%. So how can we regain the trust of people? I think that one of the ways to regain the trust of people is a strong self-regulatory regime. That we earn the respect of people, we are the servants of the people, we don't own freedom of information, we serve freedom of information. And if we have a strong code of ethics, a strong esprit de corps, and I think Malta has the distinction, not a very good distinction, that our self-regulatory regime in Malta is very, 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 very weak. Unless we journalists respect ourselves, we cannot expect people to respect us.
And the risk is if you don't self-regulate, then the state will regulate. And we've seen this in a lot of countries where you have weak press councils, self-regulatory bodies, then that's a perfect justification for prime ministers, for members of the parliament to say, look, we're obliged to introduce new media laws because journalists cannot regulate their own industry.
If I can throw a generic question to all of you. Are there normally valid reasons for big businesses to pursue legal action, because for all I know, yeah, there are irresponsible journalists and you cannot just report as you please. Or does it, from your experience, does it mean, is it just mainly a means of suppressing critical reporting?
Very briefly, I can go first. All these anti-SLAPP measures that are being proposed at national level and international levels, or amendments to improving defamation legislation, etc., they don't aim at protecting journalists who lie, who defame, who misuse the power they have. And usually we don't hear about these cases because journalists, they would not go to local organizations or international organizations and seek support because they have a certain lawsuit. They're very silent. What we need is what was mentioned before, early dismissal. Journalism or journalist is a very specific profession. They have a special mission and they are very important to our democracy. We want all people to be able to file lawsuits, but we also want courts to dismiss them very early, very quickly, when they are baseless. And if this is not the case, then of course journalists should face all the consequences. And that should be civil. We shouldn't have criminal defamation, and this is the case in most of the countries globally, not only in Europe. You shouldn't go to prison because you wrote an article which was not true, and you should not, even if you don't go to prison, if you get probation or a fine, it's a problem, because on paper that would mean you're a criminal. So civil defamation is always the solution for those whose reputation was destroyed.
Is not punishing bad journalism. SLAPP is there to punish good journalism.
To protect.
To punish. I do a SLAPP, not because that journalistic piece is bad journalism, it's not true. I do it because it's true.
It's true.
And I know that I cannot use the normal legitimate defenses that people have against bad journalism, so I use this to punish good journalists.
Matthew?
So the foundation where I work has been collecting data on behalf of CASE for over more than a year now, and I'm not aware of a single case that we've collected data on where a journalist has engaged in behavior which is genuinely intended to slander someone or genuinely intended to be defamatory or something like that. Rather, it is the other way around. I am aware of countless cases where the same law firms that are representing businesses that are being written about and are sending abusive letters to journalists are also setting up fake news websites which are intended to defame the journalist or defame protest movements or anyone who is critical of the business. I mean, case in point, with the hospitals deal in Malta, people involved in the corrupt deal paid a law firm to set up a fake news website, plant fake articles intended to defame other counterparts to the deal. I mean, these weren't genuine journalists that they were paying
But this
off.
narrative is working, Matt. I mean, there are people who believe this shit, frankly. There are people who are sharing, where it comes to the hospitals deal, there were these fictitious stories being planted as a means to defend themselves. So what can we do as journalists?
Those stories were not planted by journalists. They were planted by professionals, lawyers working at the law firms that represent people involved in these corrupt deals and so on. I mean, part of our work, unfortunately or not, has become to expose this kind of thing that is going on. When these stories were planted, we did quite a lot of work at the foundation to fact-check it, I mean, sort of work out what was really happening, and we published the results of that process. It was extremely time-consuming, but I'm glad we do it. Why am I saying this? Just to show that perceptions about, you know, journalists and perhaps their intention is to defame and so on, are, in my opinion, almost totally wrong, or wrong in like 99.9% of cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very strict, at least within our consortium, when we're assessing lawsuits, and if they meet the threshold for a SLAPP with key characteristics, there's a very strict legal assessment which goes into them. And I agree with Matthew that I haven't seen any cases which we've identified as a SLAPP which don't meet that threshold and have then been defeated in court or thrown out, something like that. But going back to the point, of course, there has to be a legal remedy for businesses to protect their reputation. Of course, there are bad media actors, but the big picture is, in many countries around Europe, it's the laws themselves that are being abused with extremely high requests for damages, long procedures in court because of flaws in the judicial systems, which drag cases out for years and years and years. It's those kinds of cases that the anti-SLAPP legislation and directive are aimed at tackling, and it's those that we're identifying as well.
Peter?
Well, yeah, the scale of the costs are just mind-boggling, especially in some jurisdictions. Like in the United Kingdom, my former employer, Open Democracy, we received a letter about this time last year from a law firm called Boyce, Schiller, Flexner, a US law firm. And it was essentially a start of a long series of correspondence from them in relation to a story we'd written about a company called Jusan Technology, which is a UK shell company, effectively. It had one registered employee. And it was based on work, primarily work that had been done by OCCRP, where I now work, which had looked at the interest of Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former long-time dictator of Kazakhstan, and had looked in particular at Mr. Nazarbayev's foundation, the Nazarbayev Foundation. And our article was alleging that billions had been siphoned through Jusan Technology at the behest of the Nazarbayev Foundation, and they were claiming that was untrue. What's remarkable about this story, it's now still running, it's still going on, it's about a year and a half later. The Jusan Technologies, as I say, again, a company with one employee at the time, is suing Open Democracy, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, The Telegraph. There's 1 day in court so far. I'm not privy to the exact costs of so far. It will definitely be over £1 million though, this length already, just for 1 day in court. UK legislation was supposed to stop cases like this, because you might ask, well, it's a company involved. How is the company able to sue? Under UK legislation, a company is supposed to show that it has had significant material damage to its reputation to sue. That was one of the changes in the 2013 defamation law. But it hasn't stopped cases like this happening. And they're far from the only ones. You mentioned Yevgeny Prigozhin. He sued Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat in London. He was actually allowed to do this specifically under, at the time he was under sanctions from the UK, but the Sanctions Act specifically allowed money to be transferred into the UK by sanctioned individuals for legal action. So the government actually actively helped him and his law firm to sue Elliot Higgins. The case eventually collapsed because of the Ukraine invasion, but actually left Elliot Higgins with £70,000 worth of costs, which he was joking on Twitter not long after Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane somehow escaped from the sky that he mightn't be seeing that cash. But the reason I'm saying is these are big sums of money, especially for small law firms or for small journalistic outlets. People like The Shift, people like non-profits who don't have high levels of insurance. These can be crippling amounts of money, but also crippling in terms of time and resources of all this goes into these cases. So it's a huge issue, and especially in jurisdictions. This is why the early strikeout is so important, which we don't have in the UK either. And I think for somebody outside, you mightn't understand just how expensive this can be, but it is eye-wateringly expensive.
But I think sometimes, though, we, as the media, are losing the PR game where it comes to SLAPP. People don't care out there what you're facing, because it really does take a lot of time. I mean, like Manuel Delia, Jason, I'm also being faced with SLAPP from this Bulgarian banker for something he did in Malta, which everybody's read about. And yet, it's time-consuming. And yet, when we write about these stories, people just don't care. So what can we do to win this PR game, to explain to our own readers that what is happening is ultimately, it's in your interest that we win this case, that we win this SLAPP case? Because from where I'm sitting, from where Caroline's sitting, sometimes you're just shouting into thin air and there's nobody listening.
Yeah, but one of the problems is, I think, that when there are stories about SLAPP, they are written in a technical manner. Mm-hmm. Who knows what SLAPP is? No.
Nobody.
Yeah. So one of the things you should do is to get Lawrence and to do a series of those.
Mark Lawrence Zamit.
Yeah, Mark Lawrence Zamit. Do a series of those videos, and that would get to people, because we cannot expect a government who institutes SLAPP cases to do a law against SLAPP cases. And also there is this problem that government set up a commission. And one of the people who was there to tell us how we should reform the media was being defended by government with all the SLAPP cases that were, this is crazy. How can a journalist cooperate with that charade?
Yeah.
So this is, unless we are united, it will not be possible. But if you want to take something concrete, get Mark Lawrence to do this.
To do one of his famous videos, which it's
more
true.
a series, has got to do a series.
It's true, because when it came to the hospitals deals, again, it was a joint investigation we did. A lot of people, read the first few paragraphs, the biggest scandal of our generation, and yet they only know there's a scandal there. The minute we got Mark Lawrence to speak people's language and explain in simple terms, finally people started getting the hang of it. Jamie, sorry.
Yeah, no, I get the question, and as advocacy organizations, we try as much as possible to get people to engage in issues of press freedom, and it's really challenging. But in response to the question, I would say that 5 years ago, really no one had heard of SLAPPs. So there is progress. It has been pushed onto the agenda at the European level by politicians and MEPs within different countries. There are now working groups across the EU. It's a slow process, but a lot of work is being done. More needs to be done by media to report SLAPPs themselves, because I think something we see is that it's just something they've experienced for years and years and years, and it's become the norm. And they need to speak out more themselves, more of these types of conferences, and more networking internationally, I think, can all help that.
Yeah.
Very often when we go to conferences, we end up asking each other what the solution is, but I don't think we can answer that question. Yes, having media and civil society as a strong pillar is key, but I think it's the responsibility of the state to make sure that they protect journalists from SLAPPs, from being assassinated, from being threatened, etc. And a few years ago, it was a bit confusing for some member states how they should do this, etc. Now you have clear standards. You have a recommendation of Council of Europe which tells, like with baby steps, to member states what they're supposed to do. And the same is with European Union safety of journalists recommendation. The question is why they're not delivering. And I think our efforts should be towards, yes, exposing what is happening so that the public understands, but that we also continue the pressure. There is absolutely no reason why Malta should not lead the way in implementing 2016 recommendation on safety of journalists. Someone was assassinated here, one of the very known good investigative journalists. And now you have Malta finding excuses every time we talk about safety, that yes, there is this law and that legislation, it takes time, and parliament, and sitting, and summer, and all this justification. The standards are there. All we need is political level across Europe, and Malta should lead the way because something horrible happened here. Yet we're still in a phase where all we hear is these silly justifications.
And maybe while we're on the subject, Matthew, after the assassination of your mother, you took personally a more proactive approach where it comes to journalists, journalism rights, and all that. And through the Daphne Foundation, which is offering assistance to journalists, do you think your work is easy? Is it, and why are you doing it at the end of the day? Is it a means of realizing that the journalists here need help, or is it because we're too weak?
No, I mean, the work isn't easy at all. I mean, it's not easy being a journalist in most places, and Malta is not excluded from that. We do journalism ourselves at the foundation. We work directly with journalists, but we also do advocacy, offering legal support to journalists through different projects that we have. And I mean, that's not easy at all. Like anyone who comes to work at the foundation they should know that they're getting into a job which is really not easy. It's going to be difficult, it's going to require a lot of effort, sometimes it's going to be frustrating. Same as with journalism. You do that kind of work for other reasons, not for money or to have a comfortable life or anything like that, but because you feel a compulsion to do something about the problems that you see, that you experience in your society. So that kind of need, that will to do it has to come from a different place, I think. But I do feel that we are making an impact, both journalists and people working in advocacy. We got a massive leg up, I think, thanks to the support we got from international organizations like IPI, ECPMF, CPJ, and so on. And now I believe we have the kind of intellectual tools and some financial support that we can use to stand up for ourselves, basically. I mean, something I wanted to say early on is that there's a bit of a tendency to call speech violent. You know, you can have violent speech and violence in speech, but actually I don't believe in that at all. And I say this as someone who has experienced all kinds of hateful speech targeted at them. Speech, writing, text in any society is a replacement for violence. So we should be encouraging people to speak their opinions, speak their minds, ideally in a peaceful way and in a constructive way. But we have to remember that also that in a democracy, tension between government, tension between the state and the rest of the society, tension between businesses, tension between consumers and businesses, this is totally normal and something that should be encouraged. So even if businesses feel they are being defamed or misrepresented, even if activists feel that way, I mean, this is part of democratic life. It's something that we have to accept, I believe. And I would much rather have that. I would much rather have the hate that is targeted at me than live in a state of censorship than, you know, where it is extremely easy to shut down any kind of discourse.
Final question before we get to maybe some questions from the people here. Are the legislative proposals being made at EU level at this stage enough to fight SLAPP?
EU or Europe?
Yeah, Europe.
Maybe, yeah.
Because that's obviously Council is a bit different to the proposals made by the Commission.
So at national level, we have some initiatives, with UK being one of the good examples. I can't explain the details. We have Charlie here for those who are interested, but we already have some anti-SLAPP provisions which were approved. I think yes, it was yesterday. So that's a very good example. But we also know that from other member states of the Council of Europe, because it's broader, we're waiting for the standards of the EU and Council of Europe to be approved. We are hoping, in terms of timeline, by June next year to have good standards in place if the EU will adopt a strong Daphne's law. Informally, the anti-SLAPP directive is called a Daphne's law. So if that will be in place and the recommendation, that would be a very good motivation for member states to come up with solutions. But at the same time, what we're focusing is just making sure that member states, and Malta being one, they don't rush with these legislation just because they want to say, look, we're doing something, because it can be very damaging in terms of protection of journalists.
Thank you, Flutura. Is there any questions or comments? Yeah, over there.
I'm a lawyer. Come on, you can now fart at me, blow us, breeze, do what you like. But lawyers use the laws that are in place badly, sometimes. Sometimes we're on the side of the guys with the white hats. But if the people who make the laws, who are lawyers but not acting as lawyers, are acting as politicians, don't give us the tools to fight back, you can whine about lawyers misusing the law all you like, it's not going to make a difference. Because lawyers use the law, as you all know when you come to us to defend the good guys. Now, if you don't change the laws, and don't stop diverting the discussion towards those nasty lawyers like Schillings and Mishkons, etc., who abuse them. They do, of course. I agree. But Unless you give us the tools, we can't fight back. Don't divert the argument onto the bloody carpenters. Look at the tools this time, not the carpenters.
Same way, like we often blame the messengers, the journalists. It happens all the time. At the back.
Thanks very much. This is going to sound a bit like a lawyer, a turkey voting for Christmas. But I think we should blame the carpenters as well as blaming the tools, frankly. And I do think what's happening with firms like Mishkon's, firms like Shillings, and the many firms which were involved in abusing the law against Daphne before she died, I think they should be held to account, and we should be held to account. Matthew mentioned the Solicitors Regulatory Authority in England and Wales. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's 28th of November 2022. It's a warning notice which went out to solicitors about abusing the law. Now, you wouldn't ordinarily be pointing to England and Wales as a leader on human rights issues, certainly in this field, but it's one area where actually robust action was taken, and rightly so. We've also seen it in relation to the abuse of non-disclosure agreements and lawyers being involved in abuse of non-disclosure agreements involving women who've been victims of abuse in the main, ending up having the law being used against them, preventing them from even getting counselling without legal threats and so on. So it seems to me this is something where lawyers should actually stand up. We as lawyers are committed to the rule of law, to ensuring that the public has trust in lawyers, and what's happening and what we're discussing proactively to face up to the fact that our profession is complicit in the abuses that we're talking about today. It is not good enough, and lawyers, rather than waiting for someone else to regulate them, need to proactively take action ourselves. This is not acceptable. It's not being done in my name, and I hope it's not being done in the name of any other lawyers in the room. Let's stand up to it and put it right.
I think there's Therese. Therese Komodini-Kakia, lawyer.
Thank you for saying I'm a lawyer. Okay, I think I want to continue from where my colleague and friend ended. In reality, the public inquiry did find that lawyers and other professionals, including accountants, auditors, every professional in this country was an accomplice to the impunity that the state was found to be guilty of vis-à-vis journalists and free expression in the country. So focusing on just lawyers isn't going to get us far enough. I think we need to responsibilize all professionals. Because if we're speaking of journalists publishing or investigating corruption or abuse of financial legislation, then if you're not going to responsibilize accountants and financial consultants and auditors, their clients are still going to end up in front of a lawyer. But besides that, I think we also need to recognize where we are at this point with, in Malta and where we are with current national proposals. And in front of me, I do have a member of the committee of experts on media, that the committee which was appointed by the government. And I have to say that the baby steps, I think Fluturam referred to baby steps in the Council of Europe resolution, for example, for the protection of journalists. Well, those baby steps haven't been met yet. Those baby steps haven't even been proposed to be met yet. So should I say, well, at least the proposals are slightly better than what we had before? Yeah, well, I could say that if I want to, whitewash everything. But I think the aim of this media reform that's happening in this country is not to whitewash the problem, but to actually address it. And I really encourage everyone to address it head on. So if we look at the proposals that were made in the last report, and the final report on SLAPP, I think, of course, it's better than the previous ones, but is it going to bring about a change in culture that will stop and prevent people from opening SLAPP proceedings against journalists and also against civil society activists. Because this is another issue that we're having. We're focusing SLAPPs only by speaking of journalists, but we forget about civil society activists. And if we look at the European Court case law, then there is also protection there for civil society activists, or shall I put everyone under the cap of a human rights defender? So I think we are at an important stage. We've received the final report from the committee, which in my opinion is weak on a number of levels. I would say, especially if you ask yourself the question, would these proposals have saved Daphne? Would these proposals have saved her from having to face the impunity that she was facing? Then the answer is clearly no. The second question that I ask myself is, will these proposals save our present journalists from facing the threats, the harassment, and the disabling environment in which they work? And the answer is equally no. So what am I looking forward to? Well, I'm actually looking forward to a white paper being launched by government, because that is what the Prime Minister promised us that he will be doing. And I'm actually looking forward for everyone who has something to say about press freedom in this country to make objective and well-researched and well-defined proposals. I think that is going to be the responsibility of everyone, including everyone here, to take that opportunity and make those proposals. But from that white paper process, I also encourage everyone to make sure that we do not allow it to be simply a tick-the-box exercise. If we do that, then we're not going to be able to complain after. Because if we complain after, the reply is going to be, well, you had 4 weeks to present your submissions and you did not. So even if the white paper is launched during Christmas time, please do spend some of your Christmas holidays addressing the consultation, because that is what I'm expecting.
It will be over Christmas.
That is what I'm expecting. So
Christmas Eve.
Perhaps we should start preparing already. But I think this is an important situation where we're at, and we're at a crossroad. We're either going to take the lead and push forward effective protection, or we're just going to lay back and let the government continue to take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. Matthew has a comment, then we'll take another 1 or 2 comments, questions. Caroline, you have to lead me here. How many more questions do we take? Matthew?
I mean, the public inquiry into my mother's assassination started from a civil society initiative. My family working with civil society organizations. What the government has done with the process of setting up the media committee is basically captured that independent initiative and bent it into something that it completely diverges from the original intention of the public inquiry, which was, as Therese said, to prevent future deaths, ensure that Malta changes completely and is no longer in a situation where a journalist investigating and reporting corruption is assassinated. So it made multiple recommendations to prevent that. Even though the Media Experts Committee only covers probably 5% of the recommendations, it doesn't tackle impunity for corruption, for example, it doesn't even solve that problem that we have with protecting journalists from abusive defamation. As Therese said, it is weak on so many levels. And it's really unfortunate that we didn't have a strong enough committee to take us to the point where we need to be taken. But a message of hope, we still have a chance to rescue ourselves from this terrible situation that we're in. As Therese said, a white paper is coming. There is probably never going to be a chance within our generation to change this. There's never going to be another attempt at fixing it. So we have this one opportunity, I think, to do it right.
Flutura, and then we'll take a couple more questions before.
I am from Kosovo. Kosovo is not a member of the European Union. We're not even a candidate country. We're trying to consolidate the democracy. And I spend a lot of time in Parliament monitoring media laws and media policies. if there is a law being drafted, I can first and foremost go physically and monitor the drafting committee, speak to them while they're drafting. I can have access to the draft law anytime I want, apart from weekends. I can provide comments whenever I want, and you get a response if those amendments are not, with the justification, if those amendments are not approved. And I come to Malta, taking that for granted. I thought that first and foremost, there must be a close collaboration between those in power and civil society. And I was absolutely shocked to see that this is not the case. And now we spend, as international organizations, we spend so much time getting hold to documents which are being drafted, be that laws or policies. Why it's so difficult in Malta to get access to public documents. We're not asking confidential information. We're not asking access to intelligence agencies' documents. We're just asking to see draft laws so that we can help, so that we can intervene, etc. Yes, there is good collaboration, at least from our side, with the committee, with some members of the committee. We appreciate that. But I'm talking here generally. I think it costs nothing to politicians in Malta unless they want to come up with policies that don't protect the public here, to involve civil society, to share information, and to seek the expertise, which is a lot here.
Thank you. Just two more questions. Julian?
Yep. So first of all, don't worry. I'm a journalist, not a lawyer, so you're not getting any rants from me. Obviously, as a journalist, in fact, one of my jobs, obviously, is to figure out the who and the why and the where and the how. So I think from this discussion, we have already touched upon the fact that at a European level, there was this directive, there was this whole process that is now under threat because it is being watered down. And both during this panel and the panel before this, there was a clear reference to the resistance from member states across the EU when it comes to going beyond this law being just a recommendation, but an actual binding set of laws. So I guess on that note, I have two questions. First of all, what is this resistance? As in, where is it coming from and what does it look like? And what are the arguments that are being put forward? I know there's an argument that's related to the national sovereignty of the state, but I think it goes deeper than that. There must be some ulterior resistance to it. So that's my first question. And secondly, I would also like to know which countries are the most problematic in this context. So which are the countries that are actually sort of actively trying to stifle this process of getting a proper set of laws which would actually protect journalists in Europe? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Can we take one? Are we in time, Caroline? One more question?
Yeah, I can do it.
I don't know where the microphone is. Fidek. Wherever.
Yeah, so now or after that?
Afterward.
At last. Well, I am neither a lawyer nor a journalist, although I comment in blogs on financial analytics, particularly of politically exposed individuals and companies and politicians. And I am a retired accountant after 30 years in the profession. Now, my point is, I will start on the freedom to information. Freedom to information is not just gathered through parliamentary questions, but it is gathered, as the lady said, from access to public documents. It's not difficult to access the public registry for registry searches on wealth. However, it's becoming nearly impossible to access public information on audited financial statements in the Malta Business Registry. The reasons, if I had to just mention, Air Malta having submitted their financial statements for the since 2018. Stewart Healthcare since 2020. Keith Schembri, the ex-Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister since 2018. Two political parties of the accounts of the media having been submitted for at least 10 years. A foundation run by the spouse of the former Prime Minister hasn't published financial statements since the beginning of the foundation in 2012. And this is supposed to be a charitable foundation, although it is practically financed by government agencies. Now, the point is that with this lack of freedom, and what is happening, you have the professional class, accountants, practicing accountants like myself. One, why should the lead accountancy firms be servicing Pilatus Bank, be servicing Sata Bank? And this is not just one firm. It's 4 firms servicing Pilatus Bank as internal auditors, as external auditors, as financial advisors, and tax advisors. You have leading lawyer firms. One of the leading lawyers who is going to become a judge. And his firm, he was involved in it as well, have been influential in helping, assisting Carl Cini of Nexia BT in corresponding with Mossack Fonseca on the ownership of E-Grant, by Michel Muscat. He was actually helping them in liaising and corresponding with Mossack Fonseca. So my point is this: we have the professionals who are helping out, rather than being the ones to speak up.
Thank you very much. Karen, one more question?
There's a question over there. He's had his hand raised for ages.
Sorry. And, and let's make it quickly. 1 and 2, please.
Okay, equally, I am not a lawyer. I say that deliberately, but I am a teacher.
Oh.
I say that deliberately because one of the leads I take is from our caption today, Silencing Freedom. We have got to build strategic alliances with society at large. We have to take journalism, legal defense. I take my lead from Father Joe. We have churches, we have women's groups, we have platforms, we have band clubs, we have youth organizations. These issues are part and parcel of building a constituency for this work. We have to break the silence. We have to make sure that we have more teachers here, more clerics, more feminists. You can choose your particular platform to work. We all have many sites that we need to work on and can work on. That's how we build the resilience.
Thank you. Arthur, just one more final question here, please, because...
Very quickly. I will not state who I am not. I will just state who I am. I am a citizen. I am a citizen of this country. And I have to declare that there is fear. Citizens confide with journalists, but they confide on condition of anonymity. Journalists assume a responsibility. They are courageous people. They assume the anonymity of the citizen, and they have to take all the risks. And they do take all the risks. They are courageous. But we're not here to discuss the courage of our journalists. It is understood, it is assumed, but it cannot continue this way. Journalists need protection in the interest of citizens. Our parliamentarians enjoy immunity. They enjoy it on behalf of the citizen, and they enjoy it so they can be effective, and they are protected. So let's move on, yes, by all means, anti-SLAPP legislation that will finally and irrevocably protect journalists. I'm leaving here today, this conference, by very happily acknowledging that a member on the panel made an emphasis in that this conference today is about not journalists' rights, but citizen rights. This is what it is all about. And citizens desperately need to be made conscious. We've had enough in Malta. You meet people who tell you unashamedly, oh, no, I don't touch politics, I'm not interested in... It's nonsense, it's ridiculous, and it's a shame. It is a shame. And we need to start doing something about this. And this anti-SLAPP legislation, done properly, as so many speakers have pointed out, is going to be a start. What I would like to conclude in terms of a statement, it's to do with the rights of journalists, and it was emphasized today, are the rights and the protection of citizens. Citizens and journalists are linked together. And this is how we protect citizens' rights. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Final question, maybe you want to answer to Julian's question.
So on your first question, why do member states not support it? I can go on with legal argument, but I think, and this is my subjective assessment, is selfishness. Oh, this is not a problem in our country. I don't think it's a problem in our country. Oh, we have mechanisms enough to fight back, and they, trust me, they find cases when they fought successfully. And our counter-argument is that this is a problem of Europe, and you need to find solution at European level. So it's because of that, and of course they use national law. We have a national law, national mechanism, etc. And secondly, I'm not naming and shaming countries today, because we have some hints from the European Union that we might end up with a strong directive, especially thanks to the pressure coming from the European Parliament, David, the President Metsola. But we also have, but I can name countries which were very supportive, Netherlands being one of them. They had hesitations because of, again, national law, but it's something to admire the way they engaged with national groups, with Parliament, with Council of Europe, etc. And if we don't get what we want in terms of anti-SLAPP directive, we will name and shame all the countries that didn't help us.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly, last point, to respond to the issue was raised about freedom of access to information. Such a big issue here. You know, hearing you talk about it does resonate. It's an issue we see across Europe. And hearing Yves talk earlier about the problems that the shift is facing here with these, you know, similar or identical legal appeals, it's exhausting to hear about it. It must be exhausting to work on it. You know, we're, as a consortium, proud to be able to provide legal support to the shift to fund that legal challenge, because I think they're doing it, you know, on behalf of all of the journalistic community here. But this is a kind of reactive response, and we also want to take a proactive response. So when we were here on the mission last year, we met with the Data and Information Commissioner, and we'll continue to advocate for strengthening Malta's FOI laws to make sure that this kind of thing can't happen again.
Thank you.
30 more seconds, because I'm in thanking mood today, so
really?
please, 30 seconds.
Go ahead, please.
I just want to say thank you, Herman, and thank you, Caroline, for keeping us informed. Because of you and because of you, it's very easy for us to understand what is happening in Malta and to react to this. This is not the case in a lot of countries. Thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you for your help. Yeah. Thank you all. I hope through this discussion, we managed to get out of this bubble, burst it, and actually start talking to it, because ultimately it's in everybody's interest. Thank you all for coming. Caroline?
I would just like to top that up. Thank you so much, all of you, for all the work that you're doing and the support that you have given us over the years. If I may close on this note, I think we need more solidarity among the journalists themselves. We haven't found much support in terms of the battles that we've been fighting. And before we learn how to, overcome the traditional thinking, that we are in competition with each other, we have to show that we actually work together. And I think today was a very good positive message that we gave. Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks to all the panelists and all here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.